Welcome back, everybody. We are going to take a deeper look into the Reagan presidency. We spent our last video looking primarily at the domestic developments of the new conservative movement, which is key concept objective 9.1. Today, we are going to look at the international foreign policy developments, which is primarily objective 9.3. 9.2 will deal with other contemporary issues, which we'll hit in our final video for period 9. But we're going to start today with just a little bit of review about what we talked about. Right? We talked about a group we refer to as the moral majority. This is not to be confused with the silent majority, which we refer to as the voter group that Nixon claims is his majority of his supporters. The elections of 1968, 1972. You could say it's quite similar, but the moral majority, look at that word moral, right? That connotation about what that means. This new idea of religious ethics or religious morality that's worked into their belief system and things that contradict the traditional Catholic religious values will not be supported by this group, and there will be sort of this fight against these massive, wide-sweeping liberal changes that we see by the new left, the hippies, the student-centered protests on college campuses, any sort of social change, such as abortion in the Roe versus Wade case. So they'll not only take on issues such as homosexuality and abortion, they'll look at any other sort of liberal change and kind of identify this as an example of what's going wrong with the country, including things like heavy drug use. And so there are campaigns to have a war on drug, if you will. We also have this economic imperative called Reaganomics. And Reaganomics, to me, sums up all of this new Republican idea under Ronald Reagan. It's a name that's given to Reagan's economic plan, similar to the way that the Affordable Health Care Act under the Obama administration was nicknamed Obamacare. Reaganomics is an example of supply-side economics, as it's sometimes called. And the basic tenet is this: the government is going to tax the citizens less, which is a great thing, right, for individuals because they get to keep more money, but there is a cost to that. By giving more money on the supply side, and remember what that means, the supply side is the individual citizens who are supplying the government with money. If you are taking in less money, you cannot spend as much. So if the government is not taking in as much money, if they're giving the supply side, the people, more of their money back, or letting them rather keep their money by reducing taxes, that means that the government has a smaller budget. The government then can no longer provide as many social services and government programs because their budget is much smaller. And so in order to have a functioning running government with a balanced budget, they must reduce the size of the government. So the government's going to get a lot smaller. Think of Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec. Kind of the Reagan philosophy is government is not the solution, government is the problem. So bringing that down. The only aspect of the federal government that will not decrease is going to be the U.S. Armed Forces. There is actually going to be a massive spike and increase in government funding and spending for the military. Other than that, almost every other single aspect of the government is going to be shrunken, or their amount of aid they're going to be able to provide is going to massively be depleted. So it is going to be much, much more what they would label as fiscally conservative-minded party when it comes to economics and shrinking the size of the government, kind of the exact opposite of something that we would see from FDR or from LBJ. Now, when we're looking at the general trends here, we can continue to think about the context in which all of these challenges are happening. We've seen the domestic context in our last video. Today, we're going to focus on the international. We are going to end the Cold War today, which we have been talking about for all of period 8. we're also really going to look at the effects, really, of the Cold War, rather the end of the Cold War and its legacy on maybe these presidents as well. We will look at different examples of change over time, or mostly military technology today. Any other significant effects during this time period, again, about what Americans are demanding of their government, or what is perceived to be demanded by the government, and really what's deemed to be important, what's deemed to be the most important issues. So our focus today is really going to be looking at the second term of the Reagan presidency. The first term, we saw a heavier focus on the kind of general core principles of the economy and shrinking the size of the government. And we saw kind of the Reaganomics philosophy with the tax breaks being implemented very quickly. But today we're going to focus more on the international side. And one thing I really want you to think about is to what extent did the two-term presidency of Ronald Reagan amount to a revolution? Because sometimes Reagan's presidency is called the Reagan Revolution. So we can think of this like an AP DBQ type question. Evaluate the extent to which the presidency of Ronald Reagan created a revolution in society. Right now, this isn't something we're actually going to see in the scope of the prompt, because we know now that traditionally, in most years, it will only come from period 3 to period 8. But it's still something that we can think about in that general light. Work on our argumentation skills, which is always important. So today, like I said before, we're talking about foreign policy, and so let's get into the Cold War. Foreign policy-wise, Reagan was really committed to trying to get America's reputation restored. The 1970s to Reagan and to many Americans looked like the United States had drastically lost its powerful reputation, that we looked like a weak, unorganized country, that we didn't command the same respect that we saw in the end of the 1940s, the 1950s, and 1960s. So we really looked to restore America's supremacy in the world. And you can see this through his quote here in 1983. We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. If people do not take us seriously, if people do not see us as a legitimate threat or powerhouse, they will try to question it. They will try to make moves. They will try to push these issues that we are trying to squash, and our role as a peacekeeper will not be effective. And he really looks at the Carter administration immediately before him, right? And many presidents do this. We can see this in the way that President Obama talked about what happened during the Bush administration, and President Trump talks about what happens in the Obama administration. About anything bad that they're dealing with, they really do look to the past leaders and say it was kind of their fault. Now, whether that's founded or not is a whole other issue, but we're looking at kind of how he perceives, or how he discusses this issue, and really how that's going to bring him forward. He says that the Carter administration really allowed for that reputation to drop to an absolutely all-time low. And so he's going to use this to really push for an increased military spending, which we're going to see. We are going to see during the Reagan administration the United States challenge different regimes in the Middle East and in Latin America still. So these are continued effects from, I would argue, all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt at the beginning of the 1900s until now. And the number one thing that Reagan is really committed to, that he really tries to push, is ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union, right? Taking down this enemy, this war that has lasted, in theory, at this point, for over 35 years by 1980. And so moving forward, we really see a hardline stance. But we'll look at the way that he talks, right, and the way that he acts, and see if there are any kind of differences there, because there are going to be some stark contrasts. Now, Reagan uses a lot of different speeches and diplomacy to take on communism. It's not necessarily a full-on military invasion. And we see in this quote, socialism only works in two places, heaven where they don't need it and hell where they already have it. Right? He labels it as this idea of good versus evil, and he uses his great rhetoric skills in order to persuade the American public and make it seem more approachable. He's also going to use military interventions. There's going to be military armament buildup. So there's going to be two different paths here. He's going to use a wide variety of tools in order to fight against communism, and he really labels it as this threat to American security and democracy. And the American public does sort of rally behind this push, and you're going to see a strong, hardline stance by the Reagan administration in many of their speeches and actions. So during the 1980s, we're going to see America get increasingly involved in the Middle East. Now, remember that the United States has been involved in the Middle East more specifically since the 1950s and the Eisenhower administration with the crisis over the Suez Canal. But it's really going to be heightened during the Reagan administration in the 1980s, and it will continue into future presidents that were still around today, such as Bush, the president that follows him, Bush Sr., that is. We're going to see it in the Clinton administration. We are going to see it in the W. Bush administration, early 2000s, the Obama administration, the Trump administration. So this is not an issue that goes away. And this is not an issue that is necessarily new, but it's heightened in the 1980s. And so we are going to see incidents such as in the southwestern corner of the Middle East, where we are going to see Reagan become increasingly concerned about an organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, a group that we would label as rebel fighters trying to overthrow the government or the improper regime in their mind in their home country. And so it's threatening the peace between Egypt and Israel during this time period, kind of left over from the Carter administration and the Camp David Accords. And this is really going to be heightened after Reagan sends Marines in 1982 to help evacuate Lebanon. There was an Israeli attack on PLO bases, and so Reagan was concerned about this breaking out into further conflicts, which it ultimately does. Marines sent in by the United States were seen like a foreign invaders, and 239 were killed when a suicide bombing attack happened. And so this is only going to hurt Reagan's reputation, especially early on, because despite this hardline stance, you have incidents like this going on. So the conflict is not lopsided in favor of the United States. There are many different, maybe label them as contests, struggles, fights, skirmishes, whatever terminology you would like to use during this time period throughout the Middle East. We can also see this hurting Reagan's reputation when he orders the withdrawal from Lebanon in 1984, which is also an election year, which makes it complicated. But one major thing that's going to help Reagan is the economic benefits, the success of the tax breaks that are really kicking in at that time period. So despite what's happening in the Middle East, he is still going to get a huge wave and absolutely dominate the election of 1984. But that's not the only issue. As you can see, there's many different things highlighted throughout this sort of area. And one of the first issues that we've talked about since the Carter administration was the Iranian hostage crisis right here, not released until January of 1981 when Reagan is inaugurated. And so issues like this and other issues, such as different terrorist groups popping up, taking American hostages in Tehran as well in 1983. It's a terrorist group called Hezbollah. As we saw in the Middle East and Latin America, there are also a wide variety of issues that are popping up the United States is going to get involved in. It's not just isolated to one particular country or one particular area. That's also going to be the case here in Latin America, where it's going to be more than just what we saw in the 1960s with Fidel Castro. There are other communist governments or rebellions that are going to be popping up that the U.S. Will be involved in. We're not going to look at every single incident, but one general theme that you need to really take away in both the Middle East and Latin America is that the Reagan administration is trying to resist communism, because remember, the USSR is still in existence. Although we haven't talked about it as directly, because during the 1970s there were attempts to lessen these tensions the tensions are going to start rising again in the 1980s. And I guess there's no other place better to look at than what happens in Nicaragua. A group of rebels that we refer to as the Sandinistas are a group of socialist, communist rebel groups that is going to overthrow a US-backed regime in 1979, only adding to the narrative that the US government under the Carter administration was increasingly weak and hurt America's reputation in the world because they couldn't handle issues like this. So a communist government overthrows the US-backed regime in Nicaragua. In 1983, Congress is going to deny Reagan's desire and his request to actually aid efforts to overthrow the communist government, the Sandinista government. And so this is going to lead us into one of the biggest issues of the Reagan administration, something known as the Iran-Contra scandal. The Contras in that case are going to refer to the US-backed rebels trying to overthrow the communist government. 1987 is when the Iran-Contra scandal is really going to bubble up. The Iran-Contra scandal, or the Iran-Contra Affair, is really going to shake the core of the Reagan administration. It's going to involve two different aspects, and it's really going to explain its name very openly. In Iran, the United States is dealing with 6 American hostages by the terrorist group Hezbollah. This is kind of an offshoot or a branch of the new government that took place after, or rather during, the Iranian hostage crisis of the Carter administration. And in order to free the 6 U.S. hostages, the National Security Council, which remember was formed at the beginning of the Cold War, and the CIA also formed then, was secretly sold missiles and weapons and arms to this government in order to negotiate the release of these 6 U.S. hostages. So they're going to sell, right? Selling implies that you give someone something and they give you some monetary compensation. That money that is used in selling these missiles, these arms, these weapons to the Iranian government is going to be taken and used to aid the Nicaraguan Contras, which are the anti-communist group that Reagan wants to support. The problem is the Congress of the United States has already shot that down. They said, no, you can't do it. You cannot aid them. And so what happens here is calls for impeachment. If it is proved that Reagan did this action, right, conducted this action, orchestrated, and even if he didn't physically carry it out, but he orchestrated it, knew about it, confirmed with it, then he could and should be impeached. And remember, this is not very long after the Nixon administration, the Watergate scandal, where although this was a slightly different issue, it was the same general structure where something was carried out by the executive branch that was clearly illegal, in this case, overtly denying a congressional order, that this could and should lead to impeachment. However, it's not going to. Reagan is going to deny any implication he has through what we would call plausible deniability. He is going to claim that he knew absolutely nothing of what was going on. He did not orchestrate it. He did not know. If he did, he would have told them not to do it. Even though he wanted to, he would have told them not to do it because Congress said no. One of the U.S. generals, General Poindexter, that is a real name, General Poindexter is going to take the fall. Some may say that this was an inside job, but he is going to say that he acted independently as a quote-unquote rogue agent, that he did this independently. Reagan had absolutely no knowledge, and this was 100% on him. And so although people didn't necessarily believe it, some did, some didn't, that he got out through plausible deniability. It was likely that he didn't know or didn't have anything to do with it. You can't prove that he did. Can't really prove that he didn't. There's no hard evidence linking him to this decision. And so as a result, Reagan is going to get off scot-free. There's no impeachment charge brought up, not really even voted upon, although there were some original calls for it. And so Reagan is going to get this reputation as the Teflon president. So these issues in the Middle East, these issues in Latin America are going to bring up some issues on the home front as well, but the Cold War is still going to be looming on. And so he's going to be dealing with a lot of different issues. However, when we look at Reagan's experience with foreign policy as a whole, we usually focus on the larger Cold War with the Soviet Union rather than the individual incidents. But when we're looking at the way that Reagan talks about communism in the Soviet Union, he frames it very much in the scope of good versus evil. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, that they are the focus of evil in the modern world, that they are a threat to U.S. security. And as you see in this quote below about all the different areas that he sees the Soviet guerrillas and terrorists at work all across the world, that they are violating human rights, unnerving the world with violence, that we need to take a hard line approach, right? This is not about compromise. This is about ridding the world of evil. He's going to do this in a variety of different ways. But one way that he's going to do this is through massive armament. Over his time in office, he's going to send over 572 nukes to different locations within the range of Moscow, the Soviet Union's capital city, to sort of counteract or counterbalance any of the Soviet Union's ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, aimed at different NATO nations, our allied nations. He's also going to begin the Strategic Defense Initiative program, also sometimes known as the Star Wars program, and we're going to talk about why, as an attempt of not only offensive capabilities, but defensive capabilities to kind of thwart any attacks that the Soviet Union may possibly make, using a system of anti-laser or anti-missile lasers in space to defend the United States, which is kind of where it gets its name. Also at the same time, we also see the amazing film franchise, the Star Wars films, really start to come out. And that's where we see a lot of this terminology kind of about it's us versus the evil empire. And so Reagan's idea, kind of born of the modern age of brand new technology that's coming around, it's not really possible what Reagan wanted. He wanted a series of different satellites into space. So again, NASA is still continuing, but putting all these different satellites into space and using lasers to shoot down any missiles that the Soviet Union puts up. And that was sort of this belief, some sort of very sophisticated system using satellites, lasers, missiles, and beams to shoot down or counteract any missiles that the Soviet Union may throw into the air, whether it be from land or from sort of a nuclear submarine launch pad. It's not really going to happen. And despite all of this, one, it's not really technologically possible at the time. And number two, it seems very counteractive to a lot of people's look at what Reagan was supposed to be about, which is lowering government spending and balancing the budget. And this is going to cost a lot of money, but different strategic defense initiatives are really going to be implemented by the Reagan administration. So an evolution really in military technology, but although we may not be in direct wars like we saw like in Vietnam and Korea, the United States is still going to be building up its military supply of nuclear warheads and other missiles in the event that anything should happen. And so America's military really becomes very, very beefed up. But probably Reagan's number one most important political triumph was probably working with the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev takes over near a similar time as Reagan. And both of these men are going to be very, very influential in ending the Cold War. You can't just talk about Reagan when you're talking about ending the Cold War. You really got to talk about Gorbachev, or as I affectionately call him, Gorby. Now, these two men are going to work to break down the sort of metaphorical wall between the two countries. It's going to take a lot of diplomacy. But Gorbachev is also looking to modernize the Soviet Union. He doesn't believe that the past model is going to work enough for his country, that he really wants to bring his country into a more contemporary age economically to be able to compete with the rest of the world. And we are going to see this through two different um, changes that Gorbachev is going to roll out in the 1980s. And it's really going to help ease Cold War tensions and sort of break down this barrier. The two legislative initiatives or major change we're going to see is perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika is going to be a form of kind of more moderate capitalism, is the way that I would really frame it. So it's economic reform. And we are going to see things being much more relaxed in terms of land ownership prohibition, allowing for small private business co-ops, foreign investment within the United States is going to be encouraged. And so the United States and other countries around the world are going to be able to invest in the Soviet Union for more business ownership, but it's going to make it much more economically similar between these nations, and it'll allow them to have more similar goals, have more of a stepping off point. The other thing that Gorbachev is going to implement in the Soviet Union is a policy known as glasnost. So perestroika and glasnost. Glasnost, I see that word glass, like we can see through glass or glasses. It's political openness. We're going to see the freedom of press, the freedom of assembly, freedom of travel and religion. It's very similar to our First Amendment rights. Competitive elections, right? Different political prisoners are going to be liberated by the hundreds. And so it's going to make the Soviet Union, once again, much more not only economically, perestroika, but in glasnost, politically similar to the United States, and it's going to allow a much more modern form of government and modern economy that's going to give both countries a greater stepping off point. And Reagan and Gorbachev are going to meet multiple times from 1986 to 1988, and they're going to lead towards the reduction of nuclear arms. The Soviet defense budget is going to be cut by Gorbachev. The Soviet Union is going to withdraw from Afghanistan. They're going to promote the expansion of democracy in those former satellite nations in Eastern Europe, kind of like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, kind of in the Baltic region. And so there is going to be change that's going to be resulting from these negotiations. And so this can be seen as a long-term development from period 8 into period 9 of the shape of the Cold War. We're not guns ablazing like we saw ourselves in the 50s and the 60s, but in the 70s and the 80s, we're going to see much more peace negotiations being more successful. But also at the same time in the 1980s, we're going to be beefing up our military at the same time to sort of flex our muscles. Maybe we think of this similar to Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy in the early 1900s. We see many different pictures between Reagan and Gorby. Reagan visiting Moscow, and they're very, very friendly in person. They do great diplomacy, but what's odd about this is it's very different than the type of rhetoric we hear coming from Reagan in speeches. His talk, his speech is much more aggressive, hardline, but his walk, if you will, his actual actions are going to be much more peaceful, much more mellow, and much more cooperative. And so we're even going to see all of these different pieces of legislation similar to like the SALT treaties in the 1970s, but eliminating ICBMs in Europe, right? Other ways of de-escalating tensions around the world. But again, despite this, we hear one of Reagan's most famous lines, his most famous speech, and this was kind of an ad-libbed line that wasn't supposed to be in the speech. In June of 1987, Reagan standing at the wall, the Berlin Wall, at the Brandenburg Gate, dividing East Berlin and West Berlin. We have Reagan's famous ending to his speech, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The crowd goes wild. It's kind of a direct call out, obviously by name and action, and eventually that wall will be torn down in the upcoming years. But despite all that, their action was much more peaceful. So we have one way how they acted versus one way how they spoke about each other. And it's kind of this weird balance between Reagan maintaining that persona and that public perception versus how he's able to get things actually done. So if you went by just how he talked, be much more aggressive, you would assume that the 1980s would be much more warlike and we'd see larger scale wars like we saw in Vietnam or Korea. But actually we see a lot more peace negotiations similar to maybe Nixon's détente policy. The end of the Cold War is going to happen not long after the Reagan administration, although it's not going to officially happen during the Reagan years. It's going to come in the Bush administration that comes right after Reagan. In 1989, a year after Reagan leaves office, Gorbachev is really going to begin promoting the expansion of democracy in Eastern Europe. And when you think about the scope of this being about 40 years, really 44 years in some cases, of communist rule since the end of World War II, that is going to be a massive change. In October of 1990, you might be able to see this right down below. East and West Germany are going to be united, and Germany will be a country once more. We are going to see many different changes happening, such as the dissolving of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, which means that Russia will be one country, but all of these other countries right here on the border, like the Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, are going to become independent nations. And so it's going to break the Soviet Union up into Russia and 10 other former countries. And it's going to create a very, very large change. We see what is left of the old Soviet Union altogether. And so the shell of this country really coming out to what it is. Now, Russia still exists today, what we says here on the Russian Federation, still a very, very large country. But this is a monumental change. We have been discussing this since the end of World War II, since the beginning of Period 8. So this has been a long-term change. But the question is, if we've been focusing on this for over 45 years, where is America going to go next? What is our attention going to be for the future that's dominated our focus for the past 45 years? Where will America go next? And the United States is going to be increasingly involved in the Middle East, continuing these issues that we saw laid out in the beginning of the 1980s under the Reagan administration. That is not exclusive to the Reagan administration we see back in the 1950s, but it's going to be a continuation of that into the 1990s and the 2000s. And so Reagan steps down in 1988 after his second term, and his vice president who is going to step up and take the election of 1988. He's going to be endorsed by Reagan, Reagan being extremely popular. Bush is going to win this election easily. He is going to continue a lot of these Reagan ideas, and that's why we sort of lump them together, almost like an extension, if you will, of Reagan, in the same way that maybe Martin Van Buren was linked to Jackson in the 1930s. George H.W. Bush is going to promise voters a kinder, gentler nation. He's really going to keep a lot of these domestic agendas. There's going to be some other ones that he's going to add and push for, right? But the big one that he's going to keep for domestically would be like the war on drugs. And foreign policy wise, Bush has a great record. He has great experience. This isn't just some random guy that Reagan is putting up there that happens to be his political lackey. He has a really, really good record. He was a former envoy to China. He used to be the director of the CIA. He was a UN ambassador. He was the vice president under Reagan for the past 2 terms. And so it's really going to help him deal with a large issue that he has to deal with during his presidency, which is the Persian Gulf War. And in 1988, before really the Persian Gulf War breaks out, he's going to be insanely popular when you're looking at the political vote. He wins almost 80% of all of the possible electoral college votes. So he does win by a large, large amount. In the 1990s, we also see some residual issues left over from the Cold War, and especially America's involvement in the Middle East in the 1980s. Now, the United States has been involved in the Middle East since the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, but there are many other issues that trickle down from that more immediately from the 1980s and the Reagan administration. Now, remember why we were there in the 1950s or 60s, 70s, 80s during the Cold War, why we were anywhere during the Cold War was to combat communism, but that is going to increase tensions with the countries that we are in at times, as seeing as we're like a foreign invader, an occupier, and maybe we view ourselves as a police force or protector. Regardless of what verbiage or jargon you use, there will be tensions that will increase in these places nonetheless. Now, what's going to happen in the Persian Gulf War is going to kick off in 1990 when the president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, is going to invade this small country called Kuwait. Now, Kuwait is a very, very tiny country, but is a very, very wealthy country. Kuwait is part of OPEC. OPEC, you may remember from the 1970s with the oil embargo, that they control a large majority of the world's oil supply. So although these countries are very, very, very tiny, because of the immense amount of oil that they possess, they are extremely wealthy countries, especially per capita. And so this is going to be seen as a very lucrative commodity for many people. Obviously, it's a very valuable resource, and the idea is seemingly what happened in the 1970s. If you control this oil supply, you can control the world's economy and sort of hold it hostage, if you will. And so Saddam Hussein is going to lead an Iraqi invasion into Kuwait. The U.S. is afraid that it will spill over into Saudi Arabia, who is an ally of the United States, so the U.S. gets involved. This is kind of the fear of like George Washington, like the Foreign Entangling Alliances, why the United States does not get involved after World War I in the Treaty of Versailles. But the U.S., along with an international coalition against Iraq, along with the help of the UN imposing economic sanctions on Iraq, is going to try to prevent this invasion and this takeover of Kuwait. The U.S. is going to move into Kuwait to try to protect and repel the foreign invaders, and the U.S. is going to begin what's known as Operation Desert Storm, with approval from Congress, of course, and the Iraqis are going to be removed from Kuwait within 100 hours, and so this is going to be an extremely successful example of the U.S. military might and foreign policy as well. It's going to utilize very heavily the U.S. Air Force, which we had seen continuously being used throughout the Cold War, but this was just another example of. Because the United States was so successful in the Persian Gulf War, Bush declared this as a quote-unquote new world order. And Bush's approval ratings were over 90%. 90% of Americans approved of the job the president was doing. And that's extremely, extremely great numbers. The problem is Bush didn't solve all of the issues. Saddam Hussein was not removed from power. These economic sanctions from the UN really didn't do much to weaken his rule whatsoever. And the American presence in Saudi Arabia really is just going to increase anti-American sentiment. We are involved in the Middle East heavily from 1980 to the 2000s, and there's all these different military operations. Remember, this is all pre-9/11 in 2001, right? 17 distinct military operations in the Middle East alone. And because of this heavy anti-American, seeing us as kind of this occupier, this oppressing force, there's going to be a rise of a radical group called Al-Qaeda under a man named Osama bin Laden, who is extremely wealthy, charismatic, and Al-Qaeda is going to be the group that orchestrates the attack on the United States on September 11th of 2001. So these all long-term trends are going to be seen, and we're going to see this build only more heavily in the 1990s around the world, culminating in this massive event on September 11th, 2001. In 1992, Bush is going to be put to the test in his reelection. And despite having this massive wave of approval for handling the Persian Gulf War, the economy that was so seemingly prosperous in the 1980s did not hold up in the Bush administration. And that becomes the real backbreaker for Bush's chance at re-election. There was a huge federal deficit from the war. The stock market was trending downward. There was a recession in 1989, Bush's first year in office, so none of these things helped. And again, a war is not cheap. This goes all the way back to period 3. Why did the British tax the American colonists following the French and Indian War? Put them into debt, trying to solve that issue. The military spending was cut, which was a very big tenet of the Republicans under Reagan. And to cap all of this off, Bush broke a major campaign promise not to raise taxes. At the Republican National Convention in 1988, Bush gives this big speech and he kind of hammers home this huge line, right, about people questioning about what is he going to do in office or what things are going to change. And he says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And the crowd goes wild. But in his administration, he has to raise taxes to cover these costs. And so doubling back on that is not going to go over well. And so his Democratic challenger, Bill Clinton, is really going to take advantage of this issue. And he's going to make it a huge sticker in the campaign. He's going to use very simple slogans like, "It's the economy, stupid," in 1992. And he's actually going to win the election despite how successful Bush was in his foreign policy. But what makes the election of 1992 so interesting is it's not just Bush versus Clinton. This is going to be one of the very few times in American history where we have an extremely significant and impactful third-party candidate. And this is a button from the first presidential debate. You have Bush, the Republican candidate, Clinton, the Democratic candidate, and a man by the name of Ross Perot, who was an independent third party. And so when you look at this map, you will only see red and blue. And so people say, the that third party doesn't really mean anything whatsoever. But many people saw Ross Perot's ideas more similar to Bush than they did with Clinton. And so when you look at the Electoral College vote, Clinton won more states than Bush, and some people felt that Perot pulled votes away from Bush, adding to the mix all of the issues with the economy. And so when you go to the popular vote down below, that is a massive chunk. He wins almost 20 million votes as a non-major candidate. And so when you add his popular votes plus Bush's popular votes, that equates to about 55.9% of the popular vote. So there is a huge split here that many people felt that this could have cost Bush the election. Regardless, Clinton wins, and we see a shift back to the control of the Democratic Party, which we are going to really pick up in our next video. But our look is going to be at how much of the Reagan ideas are going to stick. Now, when we're looking at the 1980s and early 1990s, and so we lump Reagan and Bush together, we can really sum up key concept 9.1 its entirety and almost all of 9.3, which we talked about today. So we're looking at kind of how did this neoconservatism wave move? How did the end of the Cold War produce new challenges for U.S. leadership as well? So when we look at both terms, as a president, what's very unique first is Reagan is the first president to serve 2 full terms since Eisenhower. Before Eisenhower, it was FDR. Before FDR, it was Woodrow Wilson. Before Woodrow Wilson, it was Ulysses S. Grant. So there's very few presidents up until the 1990s, the end of the 1990s, where we are going to see commonly 2 full-term back-to-back presidents. And it's a much more modern development where we saw Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama serve 2 full back-to-back terms. And so that makes it very, very unique. When we look at Reagan's supporters and the support of what Reagan was able to achieve, many people that are in favor of Reagan looked at him as a restorer of the economy, military, increase in patriotism, family values, America's place in the world. But Reagan definitely had his challengers. Many people looked at him as kind of revoking many social safety nets, especially for many different people of color. Skirted around Congress and foreign policy issues that he should have been impeached. They look at the national debt that was left, especially into the Bush administration. And so Reagan is a very complicated figure, although he's a very impactful figure. And so he's the only name that's explicitly listed in period 9. So regardless if you saw Reagan as a more impactful force positively or a negatively impactful force, you definitely didn't know him for period 9 of the APUSH exam. Now, where would we see this? We won't see this in the DBQ, although you technically could use it for contextualization or larger connections. You could possibly use this for one of the prompts of the LEQ. You could use it for possibly an SAQ if you chose to do so with choice number 4. But you will likely see Reagan come up in the multiple choice section at the very end of the multiple choice section on the exam. So I would know Reagan, I would know his ideas, and whether you know a lot about Reagan himself is not important, but the ideas that the neoconservatism movement stood for, and that will serve you very, very well on the exam. If you have any questions, you need more clarifications, feel free to drop some comments down in the section below, and we'll get back to you as soon as I can. Peace.